Welcome all. Thanks for joining us. We've got Michelle Axford with us today talking about ABVs. Michelle's going to lead us through some of the information that's available and what we can use that for. Michelle is undertaking a Doctor of Philosophy in Quantitative Genetics at La Trobe University. She works part-time for Datagene as a project lead on a new genomic acceleration project after recently stepping down from the role of group leader. And she also has her own dairy farm in Curramborough, so she's very busy. And Kate Kirk, I've known for a little while, and Kate's on a dairy farm. Kate, forgive me if I get this wrong because I know you've moved around a little bit, but I think you're at Lock now. Please correct me.
We're at Dumbog.
Oh, you're at Dumbog. See, I knew I'd get it wrong. I'm looking forward to the conversation that you guys are going to take us through today. So without any further ado, we'll get started.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, Donna and Catherine. Great to have you joining me. Kate, I'm looking forward to a great session. Lovely to see so many familiar faces and names pop up through. Yeah, I'm looking forward to being hopefully able to give you some information about Australian breeding values and answer as many questions as we can sort of through the day. But just to set the scene kind of a little bit, so my husband Mike and I, we operate the dairy farm at Curramborough in the soggy kind of flats of south of Curramborough at the moment, and you know, our calf sheds are full of calves, but they're the product of decisions that we've been making kind of over at least a decade, and some of them are mistakes and some of them are successes, but they're all the product of decisions that have been made year after year over quite a long period of time. And when I look at this picture, this is photos that were taken about 14 years apart. Chris isn't here because he's back at school, which is the only reason I'm able to show you these pictures, because I'm sure he would not be so appreciative. But it reminds me just about the incremental kind of gains and the time frame between decisions that were made 14 years ago are still impacting our herd today. And I think when we think about genetics and we think about using Australian breeding values, we are taking small steps at a time, making small incremental improvements year after year. But each of those decisions is pretty important because it affects us over the long term. The decisions that we make today are impacting cows that are going to be in our herd in 10 years' time. So we want to take a little bit of time to make sure that those decisions count, to make sure that they're the right ones for our business. The story about genetics in Australia, I think, is quite interesting. This is a little graph that shows the rate of genetic gain, so the rate of improvement for the index of BPI, which is the Balanced Performance Index. It's a single number that combines the traits that are economically important into one number that helps us rank bulls and cows and herds. And this shows the rate of gain over the past sort of 30 or so odd years. And we can see in more recent times that that rate of gain is accelerating. And this is quite important as we know that margins are squeezed. We want to make sure we're producing the most efficient, you know, highly productive, fertile cow that can contribute to our farm business over.
Sorry, Michelle, can I just interrupt you for 1 second? I'm just getting a couple of messages. Some people are finding you're a bit quiet.
Oh, okay.
Some people are finding you're okay, but there's a few that are just having a bit of trouble.
Okay, so I'm going to adjust my microphone and I'm going to speak up a little bit, and please sing out if that doesn't fix things for you.
Thanks.
I'm sure my odd Canadian accent sometimes doesn't help either, so I apologize for that. So we're just talking about the fact that in recent years, the rate of genetic gain, so how much better cows are getting each year, has accelerated. And that's really from some nice technology that has been developed in terms of genomics, which has been quite helpful, but also our ability to provide better reports and things to farmers to help make decisions a little bit easier. And we're going to talk about a few of them today. So we'll talk about some of the new traits that have been released and how we might use those. We're going to talk a little bit about the Good Bulls Guide and the app, which make bull selection much easier than it used to be. And we're going to talk about reports like the Genetic Progress Report and how we can apply that to improving the decisions that we make using ABVs. But why is it important that we want to talk about any of this really at all? And that's because this stuff really works. But I think sometimes we have to take a bit of a bird's eye view to look over maybe quite a few cows or quite a few herds to see how BPI and how better ABVs are making a difference on farm. Sometimes this stuff looks like black box magic stuff, but we can show how it works really quite well in a range of different farming systems. So this example that I want to show is the change or the difference in production between high BPI and low BPI animals in herds that have 5 different sort of feeding systems. So the horizontal axis at the bottom is a scale of the sire's BPI of some cows that were in these herds, and there's about 500 herds or so in this analysis. And the vertical axis is milk solid yield. So cows that have BPI, milk solid in every single one of the feeding systems that we've got represented in this group of 500 cows. So from low bale, which are herds that are not feeding very much supplement at all in the dairy, so less than a ton or so per cow per year, to moderate to high bale, so those that are feeding maybe 1 to 2 ton of grain or supplement per cow per year, all the way through to total mixed rations, where the cows don't see much pasture at all and they're fed completely on feed pads and in the shed. And in every one of those feed systems, the higher BPI animals are producing more milk solids. But importantly, it's not just about whether they produce more, it's also about how long do they last. If we've got cows that are producing really well and lasting a long time, we know that's a pretty good pathway to improved overall farm performance. And so in this case, this is whether animals last in the same feeding systems. And we notice that out of in all of those feeding system, cows last at least as long, if not longer, if they're high BPI animals. So I think this helps us understand the benefits of selecting the higher BPI animals. We get better performance in terms of production and they're lasting longer. We can take the same principle and apply it to an individual trait. And in this case, I should mention John Morton, an epidemiologist from Western Victoria. He's the one that's conducted this research, and we're quite thankful to him for doing that. It's been enormously powerful to have some nice validation examples to show. And in this example, we noticed that the axes have changed. So on the horizontal axis at the bottom, we don't have BPI anymore. We have the fertility ABV of the sire. And the vertical axis is 6-week in calf rate. Now the green line at the top is Jerseys and the blue line are Holsteins. And we noticed in both breeds, the daughters of higher daughter fertility ABV bulls have a much higher 6-week in calf rate. And this is just another example where we see animals that are selected based on their breeding values. When we test them in terms of performance in herds, we see that the gains are quite tangible and make an impact. So let's get into talking about what are some ways that we could use ABVs for our own individual herd. And I thought we could start with our heifers. Many of you might be actually even at the point of, might be programming heifers or even joining heifers now if we think about, a typical South Gippsland spring joining pattern. And we can use breeding values to select bulls to join those heifers too. And just if we think of some reminders about how we might use that, uh, to be really practical, we have about 45 different ABVs that are published. So it's a lot of information. We can simplify that to just using our BPI, our Balanced Performance Index, or our Health Weighted Index, the HWI. And those indices help to simplify the process of choosing bulls by having one number to focus on first. It might not be the only number that you look at, but it's a pretty good one to start with. You might want to select which index matches your particular farming operation the best. Do you want a balance of traits, production, health and fertility, longevity, or do you want to focus and put more pressure on health traits, so fertility and mastitis resistance? And depending on how you answered that question, if you want the balance, then you would choose the Balanced Performance Index. And if you wanted to push more health, wanted to go faster for health traits, then you might choose the Health Weighted Index, the HWI. So start with your index, then check the breeding values for your priority traits. Looking at 45 traits is too many traits. So pick a half a dozen, 3 or 4 or 5 traits that are really important to you and check the breeding values for those particular traits. Now, the Good Bulls app does a pretty good job of making that filter work nicely for you. So that's a good thing to have in your back pocket so it's free to access. When we're thinking about heifers, an important trait to remember is the use of the calving ease ABV. It had an upgrade earlier this year so that it's available for more bulls, particularly the genomic bulls. So that calving ease ABV is really important to make sure that we're choosing bulls that are at least 103 for if we want to reduce the chances of having calving difficulties later on. So that's particularly important for our heifers and probably important for cows as well. The next group is when we're picking our bulls. I think it works best if we don't just choose a couple of bulls, but let's make sure we've got a team of bulls. And you might start with a list of 12 or even 15 bulls. Then you can sort through a little bit based on price and the availability of sex semen, for example. And you can work with your herd improvement advisor to kind of narrow that list. So start with a generous list and filter them out based on which ones get a bit too pricey or we've run out of stock at the particular point of joining that we're at. And the last point of advice, I think, around AI and heifers is making sure we've got a team of bulls. Let's not rely just on 1 or 2 bulls. It's always good to have a team of bulls. It's good insurance. So the next group, if we think about our, let's think about our cows next. So in our cow group, again, similar principles apply. Make sure we know what index we want to work with. That makes the job a lot easier for you. Check the breeding values for the traits that are a high priority for you and your business. You might think about a new trait like gestation length, for example, especially for later joinings. So what gestation length does is it identifies the bulls whose calves are born a little bit sooner than others. And so that might be helpful if you wanted to shorten up your calving period by a couple of days, particularly for later joinings. And don't forget, it's a team game. So making sure we've got a team of bulls, so we're not just relying on 1 or 2. That helps to spread the risk. There's some other ways that we can use breeding values on farm these days, really through the introduction of genomics and the ability to be able to genotype our heifers. Those calves that are in the sheds now, they're prime for genomically testing. They're easy to get to, it's easy to collect a sample, and really within a couple of months, about 7 weeks or so, you'll get some results back that show you what the future potential of those animals are, allowing you to choose which ones are going to be your best herd replacements. And I think that presents businesses with opportunities, either for growing your business, so knowing which ones we're going to use to grow our herd. It gives you options for increasing livestock revenue. So by identifying which ones might meet a particular market requirement, you'll have that information quite early while the calves are actually could even still be drinking milk, and you've got some information to be able to work with quite early. You can prioritize the keepers. So those animals that are going to be your replacement animals that are destined for the herd. We can, if push comes to shove, we know that those are the core ones that we want to look after to make sure we've got well-grown heifers entering the herd. And lastly, breeding values and the genomic testing process works out parentage. So you know who's who. It's quite easy to make mistakes in terms of knowing the pedigree of animals, and the genomic testing process helps to sort that out for you. And the last example that I thought might be useful to think about how we might use breeding values is in thinking about which ones we don't want to breed from, well, at least to AI. So those low BPI cows, we saw earlier that the low BPI cows, they don't produce as much and they don't last as long. We can work that out at an earlier age. You might decide that your low BPI cows, if you've got replacements to work with, that you might not want to breed them to dairy because you've got enough heifers already, and those ones, they're likely to lead to low BPI calves. So if you don't want to kind of continue that line, then using the breeding values can help you work out which ones you don't want to breed from. So if you've got enough heifers, and I know that's not the position for everyone, so that's why I think it's important to kind of categorize yourself. If we've got enough heifers, consider allocating high BPI sires over your top and middle cows. Consider using sex semen for early calved cows that are in good condition and that aren't too old. If you've got some cheaper semen on hand or some beef semen, you've got the opportunity to use that in bottom cows, remembering that the lower BPI cows are going to breed low BPI heifers. So those are some opportunities that are available by having information at your fingertips through breeding values. Just a couple of tips or tricks, things to kind of watch out for, where I sometimes hear people where they kind of get caught a little bit. First one is ABVs. They can't be compared between breeds. So when we're looking at ABVs, we can compare Holsteins to Holsteins, Jerseys to Jerseys, red breeds to red breeds, Holstein crosses to Holstein crosses, but we can't compare Holsteins to Jerseys or Jerseys to red breeds. They work within a breed group first. So that's one thing just to kind of remember. The second suggestion is just to kind of keep an eye on your breeding goals. So thinking about what you want your herd to be able to do. And keep that focus for a sustained period of time. Sometimes people will dip in and dip out, and this year they'll want one thing and next year they'll want something else, and it's hard to make genetic progress in that with that thought in mind. But knowing what your goals are for your herd and keep focused on that for a few years, that's where you'll start to see improvements. ABVs are available for virtually all bulls. So if someone says that an ABV is not available, ask a few more questions and be a little bit suspicious, because the information's there and available. Yeah, so it's good to make sure you check that. And the last little sort of tip is just to check and make sure that all the dairy bulls that you're using are from the good bulls. Are good bulls, so that they're in the Good Bulls guide, or they're in the lists on the Good Bulls app. It's just a good safety mechanism to make sure that we've got working with bulls that are going to improve our herd. Genetics it's permanent. It's not something that you can reverse very easily. It's compounding, and then it builds year on year on year. And a nice example of this, and again, John Morton has really nicely kind of helped us through some work with Dairy Australia to think about what it takes to make improvements at a herd level. I'll just go through this graph a little bit to kind of help explain it. So the blue line is, this is for daughter fertility ABV, and this is a genetic trend. So the average daughter fertility ABV for groups of animals organized by their year of birth. And the blue line are the bulls, and the red line are the cows. So the cows are a bit better than the bulls, and we've noticed that particularly in the 90s and even in the early 2000s, that genetic trend for fertility had declined. We took our eye off the ball. We weren't measuring it. We weren't calculating breeding values for it. And through that time, we did see a significant decline in the genetic ability for cows to get in calf. So that happened earlier in the bulls than it did for the cows. The cows have always been a little bit better than the bulls. The bulls are improving, and if we see the tail end of that blue line, it's going up really nicely, and that's promising to see, really, with the ability to kind of measure that trait and the ability to have genomics included. So the bulls are going up nicely. The cows are starting to rise, but look at that little green line. That green line is actually a whole herd. And because it takes so long to get a whole herd of animals to kind of move in the right direction, the improvement in the genetic gain for fertility is a little bit, it's coming, but it's slow because it takes time for a whole herd to be kind of compiled. So I think it's just a nice reminder that there is a lag time between when we make decisions and when our whole herd has seen that improvement. So it's sustain the pressure over time and be focused on what we want to achieve. Every herd's got a different story. Your stories are all going to be unique to you. And it's great to have Kate Kirk with us today. Kate is a local South Gippslander, as Donna had mentioned, and Kate has kindly agreed to talk a little bit about her breeding goal and the sorts of things that she's found works for her. I think it's fair to say, Kate, that you and Jason, you've been on a bit of a growth pattern in recent times, building in terms of the land that you're running and certainly milking more cows. So the breeding choices that you make continue to be sort of quite important. Kate, what we've got in front of us here, you'll recognize this is your herd, but presented in a different way. Instead of kind of out in the paddock, this is your herd genetically. Looking at the genetic trends for BPI over a period of time. And so each of these, we just duck in to kind of get the right laser pointer. Each of these dots is the average of a group of animals. And for example, this one here, these are the animals that were born in 2018 and what their average BPI is. The yellow line is Kate's herd, and the black dotted line down here is the national average, and the gray dotted line at the top is the top 10% of the country for Holsteins. And I think you'll notice Kate's herd sits up really nicely as one of the absolute top herds that we've got. The ranking tells us that her herd sits at 177 out of the whole entire country. The genetic progress report tells us that she's making progress for quite a number of traits, for the BPI, for the HWI, as well as fertility type production longevity. So she's been doing a great job and on the right track, but I don't think she's stopping here. So Kate, could you tell us a little bit about your breeding goals and how you will go about kind of choosing semen that might be going into your cows in the next few weeks?
Yep. So we purchased our herd off my husband's parents over 10 years ago. And they already had a sensational herd when we bought them, which is very lucky. And they had about 30 years of breeding data already compiled for us. So we had a lot to work with. We did find over time, however, that although they were excellent producers, that was starting to give us a little bit of trouble with what was happening in Australia, which was a little bit less cows in calf or cows getting in calf fairly later. We were having issues with I wouldn't say lameness in particular, because our farm was very steep, our previous farm. That didn't help, but I think preventable sort of herd health issues that comes with very high production cows, with, you know, milk fever, mastitis, lameness. And because we had a relatively high turnover of heifer calves, we had a lot of replacements. So it was very easy to ignore those, to ignore those things to an extent, because I always had, you know, 35% of my herd every year were first calvers. So I didn't have to deal with the ongoing health issues that those cows would have had over a period of time. And then after a while, because I didn't come from farming originally, so when I took over the breeding program and the AIing, I started looking at why is it out of balance. I didn't even know how to read the ABVs when I started, so I got my local rep to explain to me how to read everything and what it means, and because I listened for 3 or 4 years to my husband and his father talk about them. Basically, and so our new farm is quite flat, which our animals, I think, generally are actually possibly slightly too big for our new farm. That creates a little bit of paddock damage and that sort of thing. And ideally, they were probably slightly too big for our steep farm as well, because they did a lot of damage walking up and down hills and gateways and things like that. So I try to choose lower in the size, lower sort of size and frame stature, that's what it is. And
when you do that, what's the trait that you look at, Kate, just so that we get the names sort of?
It is stature.
Yeah, it is. Yep, you're right. Yep.
Yeah.
So you look at the stature ABV.
Anybody with an extremely high stature, even if I like them, I'll just disregard, because I don't need them any bigger than they are. Yeah. And we also had a few issues. So I think over about 10 years, the sort of empty rate went from sort of 7-ish% up to about between 15 and 20. But I think we also increased the herd's production by up to 40% in that 10 years as well. So I think that correlates pretty evenly. But also when we were looking at the genetic progress report, which we do every year, we could see, so all of my balance, performance, health and type is all with the arrows pointing up right now. It wasn't like that before. So you can see there was a dip in I think fertility started to become a fair issue on the downhill.
Yeah. So this is a part of the genetic progress report that looks at fertility, and you know, there's a period of time when we're, you know, maybe heading downwards and progress might have been a little bit sort of flat, but you've made a change, Kate, haven't you?
Yeah, so I didn't actually realize what I was doing probably initially when I started choosing the bulls. I didn't take much stock in the fertility part, and I was choosing for production, and I was following sort of what I was told. And then when I started to look into it a bit more, and I sort of thought, you know, well, we can improve it. Also, I'd learned how to do all the AIing and stuff, so I'd felt, is it affecting our ability to get cows? Is it the fertility of the cows, or is it my AIing? So I figured, you know, it can't hurt to make sure they're genetically predispositioned to getting calf, as well as trying to have good practices on top of that. Yeah. And cows is the way that we make the most money, whether it's through milk or through excess stock. So getting cows in calf is the number one priority. So when we saw the in-calf or empty rate or whatever going up, we thought better address it, because we're losing money. And there wasn't a lot of, we didn't have a lot of extended lactation cows back then because we were seasonal calving, but now we split calving, and we actually threw in a third joining this year. So, and we've moved from, I think we originally had a 12-week joining in, which was like a spring joining, and then we had a 1 year where we had about 25% empty. So we decided to keep cows, carry them over, and over about 7 years, 5 to 7 years or something, we've just naturally brought them over. So I think the first year that I carried cows over, I ended up with about 5 calves. But it's got to the point now where we're moving towards a 50-50 split. And it seems to work well. We were herd testing, because we herd test, we were comparing our extended lactation cows to our seasonal cows, and they produced the exact same amount in the same period of time. So it wasn't, the empty rate wasn't really the concern in terms of milk loss and profit loss. So because we, you know, as you do, we'd have some heated discussions about, do we keep extended lactation cows or not? And in relation to fertility, I don't feel for us that it mattered very significantly. However, getting them in calf was very important. And as much as we wanted to argue about it, the data was showing it was going down. So, and something that I've done over the last 5 or 10 years is realize that if I want to be heard and make changes, I have to have data to back that up. So doing the herd recording and using all the data and assessing the heifers and things like that is invaluable. So everyone else's work that goes into it is invaluable for me, because then I've got something to actually work with.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's great, Kate. Can we just have a look at this graph just to make sure that we're kind of understanding what's in front of us? Because I know it's easy to sometimes sort of skip through these sort of graphs, but so the yellow line again is your herd, and it is going up sort of nicely now, but probably had sat below the sort of national average for a while. Each of these dots is a group of cows organized by their year of birth. So this dot here is the average daughter fertility ABV of cows born in 2016. So your herd reproductive performance might look different. It might have a different pattern to it. This is the genetic component of those cows. And each dot is a group of cows organized by the year of birth. So you can look at, you know, what this year's heifers might be. These are some early, maybe some autumn heifers. I noticed that there's a lower number of these girls, so maybe not
yes, I haven't
yet. Yeah, that's okay. But so, you know, this is where our autumn girls are sitting, and once you add your spring girls in there, you know, that point might move up or down depending on what their breeding values are. Based on what we know about the sire and the dam. So I just thought I'd just highlight that so people are kind of can separate what a trend in 6-week in calf for a whole herd. That picture is not the picture that we're presenting here. They're 2 different pictures. This is just the genetic underlying kind of ability of animals to get in calf organized by year of birth cohorts.
Yeah.
Cool. Now, this is new for Kate. Kate hasn't seen this before. This is Kate's Genetic Futures Report, which is a new feature on DataBat. But I thought it would be worthwhile just kind of highlighting for you, if I can click the right button. You know, we think it's nice to be able to kind of see what is happening in your own herd in terms of differences between the high BPI animals and the low BPI animals. And so this does that sort of same analysis that we did for the kind of national herd, but it does it at an individual herd level, and these are Kate's cows. So the blue column is the high BPI animals, and the green is the lower BPI animals in the same herd. And just for this trait of fat kilos, for example, there's about 40 kilos difference of fat per cow per year if they're the higher BPI end of the scale. Same is true for protein. There's an extra 20 kilos of protein. So already we've got about 60 kilos of milk solids difference between the high and low in Kate's herd. Some herds you'll see more variance than that, and some you might have more even performance. But yeah, there's about 60 kilos, which might add up to be a few dollars there, Kate, if you multiply that by 430. Although that's not, you can't multiply by 430 cows because not all of them are high or low. They'll have lots in the middle. Now, it also shows not a lot of difference in milk liters between the two, just a little bit more milk with the higher BPI animals, which you'd expect. Longevity is a bit similar, so 36 months for the low BPI cows, 34 months for the high BPI cows. Oftentimes we would see this being reversed, but each herd has a different story, and so I think it's nice to be able to look at information for your own herd. And Kate and I were having a conversation yesterday about some of the changes that have been made by moving farms, growing, adding more animals as you've grown to take on more land. So that's probably might be having sort of an impact on this one. And in the case of calving interval, they're spot on, dead even, similar calving interval between the two. What we're seeing more often as the BPI has a lot more fertility in it than the older indexes used to be. What we're often seeing now is the calving interval is a little bit shorter in the higher BPI animals, and that's what we would expect. That's great. Look, I just want to give a little example, Kate, and you can help me and step in here if you would like to contribute to this in terms of how you would choose bulls. But I thought we've talked a lot about breeding values more generally. Yesterday, you mentioned about having those catalogs that arrive, and it took you some time to kind of learn what each of the numbers were. And I thought maybe we could just show a little example that might help others know what those individual numbers mean. So I've got an example with half a dozen or so. It could be bulls or cows, it doesn't really matter. And I've just listed just 4 traits. So BPI, protein kilos, daughter fertility, and mastitis. So these are 4 of the sort of 45 traits that you could get for each animal. And in the yellow line is what the average is. And this is kind of helpful just to give you a point of reference. So for the BPI, the average is 0. And so things that are above 0 are generally good. And if they're below 0, they're actually quite bad if they're below 0 these days for BPI, at least for Holsteins and Jerseys and Reds.
Michelle, sorry to interrupt. Yes. Are you happy to take a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Yep. Do we have a way of understanding what proportion of a herd's fertility is due to genetics versus herd management / calving date?
Yeah, great question. So the measure that we can use to separate the influence of management from the influence of genetics is a term we call heritability. So how much of the difference in a breeding value is passed down from father to daughter or mother to daughter. And in the case of fertility, it's pretty marginal. It's only about 5%. And sometimes you could think, well, that's just too low to be kind of even worried about. Management is way more important than genetics. And while that's true, there's still a difference. And the data that John Morton has been able to show us about the real difference on farm, difference between high and low daughter fertility, shows that the genetics is still, even though it's slowly heritable, is still contributing quite a lot. And if we can choose bulls that are higher for daughter fertility and not give up much in terms of other traits, or they're not even more expensive, it probably makes sense to make it just a little easier for you to get those cows and calf. So the measure that we use is heritability, but even though it's low, it's still worthwhile chasing. Does that help, Donna?
Oh. Yeah, thanks, Michelle.
Okay, great. Yeah. Lovely. So I was just mentioning that the average for BPI is 0. Let's hop over to that daughter fertility one. That average is 100. So if we want to improve daughter fertility, we need to be working at least above 100. And if your herd average is already quite good for daughter fertility, you might need to even be higher than that. The same average is true for mastitis resistance. The average is 100. But I skipped over protein kilos. Protein kilos has the same average as BPI, which is 0. So if you've got a number like 40, in the case of protein, that's 40 kilograms of protein more per cow per year. than the average of 0. In daughter fertility, 105, so it's about 5% better 6-week in calf rate than the average of 0. In the case of mastitis resistance, 102 is 2% better than average for mastitis resistance. So generally the numbers on the top side of 100 are a bit better. So we can compare to the average of 100, or we can compare to other animals as well. So Kate, if you had to look at this list, you've got a big high 400 BPI animal here, lots of protein at 40 kilograms, 105 for fertility, 102 for mastitis. How does that compare for you and your business if we look at compared to the second animal, which is just a little bit less for BPI, less production, but quite a lot better for fertility and mastitis? What would you reckon?
I would definitely go with the second one.
Yep, that might fit your business. Yep.
Yeah, because
absolutely.
I already have a significantly higher genetic predisposition for good production with fat and protein. So I can put a little less weight on that, whereas I need a lot more weight on health and longevity and those sort of features from now going forward, without compromising too much, obviously, on production. But if I can get the whole package, I'll take it.
Yep, cool. Now I'm going to put you on the spot. Let's hop down to number 5. So BPI of 160, so quite a lot lower. So it's $160 BPI versus sort of $390 BPI. So look, it's a rough. It's trying to kind of match up with profit. It's so there's quite a big difference between those two animals. 5 kilograms of protein, 116 for daughter fertility. So someone could say he's the best bull on this list for daughter fertility.
Absolutely.
And 100 for mastitis. How would you rate that bull compared to the bull that's number 2?
I would be looking at, for me personally, I would probably see if there was somewhere I could fit him in on my lower fertility cows, because especially on my really low fertility cows, he would be excellent over them.
Yep, you want to make those lower ones go faster.
Yeah, and I don't have a huge issue. I think my mastitis resistance is quite good genetically speaking. So that's here nor there at 100. Doesn't make me better or worse, but I'm getting extremely good fertility. And essentially you can control profitability a lot with management as opposed to just genetics alone.
Yep, we need both genetics and management to work best to kind of get the most out of this system. So what we're giving up here to choose the bull that's down at the bottom, we're giving up 1% daughter fertility, so 1% 6-week in calf rate. That's the difference between those two animals. We're giving up 15 kilograms of protein, and we're giving up 15% of mastitis resistance ABV. To get a BPI that's that low, we're probably giving up on some other traits like survival and other traits as well, but I haven't kind of listed that here. So these are the choices that we need to make, and we just want to make sure that the bulls that you pick are the ones that are right for your particular system. So these are the exact conversations and debates, I'm sure, Kate, that happen when you're flipping through those catalogs and checking with your advisors as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, where could you get some of this information that we've shown you about Kate's herd? And the location for that is a new tool called DataVat. DataVat is linked to a big database, a central data repository that's been building over the last few years that Datagene looks after, but with lots of input and investment from Dairy Australia. So the central data repository is where all of the animal performance information is now stored. And as farmers, you've got free access to be able to get DataVat, and you can look at it to see about bull information. If you herd record or you genomically test, you can also see cow information on DataVat. What's interesting about DataVat is not only can you see it, but you can also share that information with your trusted advisors. So it might be a vet that you're working with, it might be a herd improvement advisor that you're working with, but you can share that information with them using DataVat. And there's information on the DataGene website to get you started, or give us a call if you need a hand. Just before we get into the kind of more of a conversation, I just wanted to mention a couple of the new things that had happened in terms of breeding values this year, in addition to DataVat. One is that the indices are getting an update, because we have to make sure that they keep pace with the economic market that we work in and changes that are happening genetically. So you'll see some updated indices coming through in December. I mentioned the new traits that came through in April. There's about 8 new traits in April. So we have quite a range of traits that people can incorporate into their breeding program should you want to. And just watch out, there's some new reports that are being tested as we speak. So DataVat is growing, and there'll be some new reports that we expect to see there in 2021. And I should just to call out to Dairy Bio, the research that is incorporated into the services at DataGene comes from Dairy Bio. So it's quite important, and it's a great resource that Australian dairy farmers have the opportunity to benefit from a strong research program. So just in summary, I think it's just good to remember to take a little bit of time when we're making our genetic choices, because they do make a difference over the long term. Just check and make sure all of the bulls that we're using, all the dairy bulls that we're using, come from the Good Bulls Guide. So that's a bit of protection mechanism that's set there for us. When we're using cow ABVs, we can use those to select herd replacements and make some some good mating choices, and they're accessible through DataVat these days. And there's just a little few tips in terms of where you might be able to go for some more help if you're wanting to have a further conversation. Pete Williams is around to be able to have a chat with. There's also an email address there that you can shoot through questions if you think of some things after today, and certainly reach out to me if you'd like to have a chat as well. So Donna, if it's okay, I'd like to stop sharing my screen, because I actually haven't been able to see the chat as we've gone through. So I'd like to be able to get to those, hopefully answer some of those questions. So I'm just going to stop sharing so I can see you and see that chat box.
That's great, Michelle. You've answered the questions that have gone into the chat box as we've gone through, so that's awesome. I've had one person that's missed half your presentation because they're in a dodgy area, as in the PowerPoint. So what I'll do is I'll PDF your PowerPoint and then send that out, so anyone that has had problems today viewing that will can have a look at it. So they haven't missed out on the conversation. It's just that they couldn't keep up with that.
I'm so sorry about that.
PowerPoint, yeah, no. It's just what happens with this sort of thing when, internet's dodgy. That's why I come into the office when I have to facilitate, because if I was sitting at home, I would have dropped out half a dozen times already. We just had a comment from Debbie Twist that said, great presentation and summary of current upcoming information. So thanks, Debbie, for that feedback. That's awesome. So now's our opportunity to have a chat for a few minutes. So if you've got any questions, either pop them in the chat box, or if you've got your camera on, stick your hand up and we'll take a question or two. Don't be shy.
Now, Jody, your picture is making, are they scones in the background?
Yes, Michelle, they are. I'm a CWA member.
I'm
a CWA member, and we've got the big scone tally thing happening this Saturday. So it's scone week this week, basically.
That's just not fair as we approach lunchtime.
He's awesome. So have we got any questions on what Michelle's spoken about? Anything that anyone wants clarified? Any questions around any of the data that she showed us in those graphs? No? You must have done a great job of explaining everything, Michelle.
Well, I think it's much easier though by having Kate joining us and giving a real world perspective on the choices that get made. I appreciate you being involved, Kate.
Does anybody else use the Good Bulls app? Anybody currently here? Do they use the Good Bulls app?
I do, but I'm biased.
Anybody else?
I used to, Kate. I haven't done any bull selection for a couple of years, but yes, I used to as well.
Yeah. So I find the Good Bulls app useful for mostly when I'm out and about talking to people, that if they say something about a particular bull or someone's, you know, everyone's bull that they choose is the best bull. So because you don't always have the catalogue with you, so you can always jump on the Good Bulls guide, type in whoever it is they're talking about, and then you can see whether it's really a good bull or whether they just think it's a good bull, which is handy when you haven't decided who you're going to choose or why you might want to use them.
Rose, were you waving there a minute ago?
I was just going to say that back in our old day, Michelle, there wasn't that many bulls, and these days there's so many bulls to keep up with. It's not funny.
Yep. Yep.
You know, with the genetic testing and everything, like there's just so much to keep in touch with.
Yeah, and back those days, Rose, we could remember bulls from year to year, and you could trace back their pedigrees, and you know you could reel off 3 or 4 generations of pedigree without any hassles. It's just not that way these days, and that's where I think either my brain's kind of shrinking or the data's just got much bigger. One of the two, but you know, I think we need to use the tools like the app, or if you prefer spreadsheets or web searches, you know, DataVat's got web search. You can download spreadsheets if you like to work with Excel, or use the app, because we depend so much on those numbers to give us the right, to give us a good list these days. It's just too hard to keep track. The Good Bulls app, it's got, you know, there's over 1,000 bulls in the Good Bulls app. So if someone's trying to suggest that they've got a good bull that's not in it, do some more questioning to make sure that it's really the right bull for your business, because there's 1,000 in there. Yeah,
so many bulls out there.
Yeah,
because I found that I was getting, because I was using calving ears bulls over my heifers, and I do a fairly extensive heifer program, that I was getting over the last sort of 4 years. I've had heifers coming in that are a bit sort of small chested. Obviously for calving ears, they're not wide in the chest or wide in the pins. But I have to be careful to counteract the number of smaller framed, smaller chested heifers that I'm getting to match up with the kind of production that I want my herd to do. So it was actually another thing that I used to filter on the Good Bulls guide for. I was having trouble when I was looking, because I normally use the booklets and the paper, but I was having trouble finding a bull or a selection of bulls that had like pin width and chest width and depth that was above 100 all in one, that was also high fertility and high BPI. I found that there was a lot of low BPI bulls that had it, but I only, you know, I didn't want it to be too low. So I think I ended up, after I put the filters in, I ended up with about 4 bulls that sort of suited what I was looking for, and 2 of them weren't current.
Yeah.
So
one of the things to be a bit, and genetics is a marvelous thing, and there's so much to kind of learn from it. But one of the things that we've noticed lately is some of those traits that we've often looked for, chest width and body depth. We would think that they're really highly connected with fertility, but you know, for some reason, the relationship between those two is not what we would expect. And so as we've gotten higher daughter fertility ABV bulls, and we are seeing that the ABVs for chest width and body depth are smaller. So in fact, a good bull may be 98 rather than, you know, 105, for example.
But is
98 is still better than 90.
going to be the new 100, and then our production levels sort of.
Yeah, it's all a balancing act, and that's why, you know, the BPI is really helpful to kind of try and keep pushing as many things forward as we can, because there's interactions between these traits all the time that we have to cater for. Just like there's interactions with grass, you know, grass have you know, that's got different characteristics from variety to variety, and the same thing is true with ABVs and cows.
Lisa, have you got a question there?
Yeah, I'm trying to just work my microphone out. Michelle, I'm not sure whether this is directly related and what information you can get on the Good Bulls guide, but are you looking, or do you look at the haplotypes in relation to the fertility in what you're doing with the BPIs?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lisa.
Important are you putting on that for across all breeds?
Yeah, that's a good question. So haplotypes are little segments of DNA, and if we have 2 copies of that particular segment of DNA, then we end up with a negative kind of outcome. And there's quite a few haplotypes, particularly related to fertility, that have been discovered in multiple breeds. So different patterns in different breeds, but there are haplotypes in multiple breeds. The outcome of those haplotypes is reflected in the daughter fertility ABV. So if an animal has kind of, haplotypes or multiple haplotypes, eventually that will impact on the daughter fertility ABV. And that's the piece that's included in the BPI. However, there are times when if you're running a breeding program, you know that you have a lot of those haplotypes, negative haplotypes already in your herd. You might want to avoid bulls that have the same haplotypes in your herd. Or you have, you're doing a flush program and you want to try and have the best chance of success for the flush program, you might want to avoid using haplotypes in those cases. So there are some specialty times when you might want to use the haplotypes in themselves. But for most of us, the fact that that the impact of those is included in the daughter fertility ABV helps us, and that's how it contributes to the BPI. Through a project that we're working with Dairy Australia, we know there's an opportunity for Australia to be able to give more information about haplotypes than what we do at the moment, and that's on our list for this year's work plan, is to be able to broaden the reporting of those haplotypes. So watch out for some more on that, and you'll see those in DataVat. There's a nice reporting tool that's being built in DataVat that will show those haplotypes more clearly and give you that information a bit easier than what you've had access to in the past.
Very good. So you can actually access that via DataVat now, Michelle? Yeah.
Yes, for haplotypes that have been contributed by bull owners. So for people that have put that information in, that information is now available for DataVat, but we want to kind of complete the reporting by having it available on more information, by having the genomics sort of call that for us and be able to give it for more animals.
Excellent. Good. It's good to hear you're working on it.
Thanks, Lisa.
Right. We have just gone over time slightly, but if there are any more pressing questions before we wrap up, I'm happy to take those. No more? All right. I'd just like to say thank you to Michelle and Kate for taking the time to discuss the ABVs with us today. And Kate, thank you for sharing some of your data. That example was very helpful for my understanding the ABVs. So I'm sure it's the same for many other people.
Thank you, Donna. It's been a great opportunity. Appreciated the chat. Thanks, Kate, for joining in. Yeah, it's been lovely to have you.